Los Baños. In the Philippines, the morning of the 23rd of February, 1946, a heavy-set Japanese man in a plain uniform climbs a wooden staircase, one slow step at a time. There are 13 steps. He climbs them without a word. At the top waits a rope. Just 4 years earlier, this same man had won one of the most stunning victories of the entire war. He had captured the fortress of Singapore and humbled the British Empire, taking an army more than twice the size of his own. The world had called him the Tiger of Malaya. Now they were about to hang him as a war criminal. And here is the strangest part of all. The man whose signature sent him to this gallows had never once beaten him on a battlefield. In truth, the two of them had barely fought each other at all. This is the story of two of the most famous commanders of the Pacific War, one American, one Japanese. History hands us an easy verdict: the conquering hero and the hanged criminal. But that verdict is a myth. Their real contest was never settled by generalship. It was settled by industry, by image, and in the end, inside a courtroom. To understand how a conqueror ended his life on a gallows, and whether it was justice or revenge, we have to go back to the beginning. Tomoyuki Yamashita was born in 1885 in a mountain village deep in the Japanese countryside, the son of a local doctor. He was not born into the warrior aristocracy that ruled the Japanese army, but he was big and sharp and relentlessly driven, and the army became the whole of his life. At the military academy, he graduated near the very top of his class. One classmate would shadow his entire career, a cold, ambitious officer named Hideki Tojo. The two men came to despise one another. Remember that rivalry one day? It would cost Yamashita everything. By middle age, Yamashita was a mountain of a man, well over 6 feet, built like a bear, with a shaved, egg-shaped head. He led from the front, spoke bluntly, and believed to his core in the old samurai code. To his soldiers, he was a hard, demanding master, but one who shared their hardships and never asked of them what he would not face himself. He carried himself with a heavy, fatalistic calm, as if he had long ago made his peace with death. There was nothing of the courtier in him. He said exactly what he thought, and it won him powerful enemies. By the time war came, he had risen to command an army, yet he was already a controversial figure, distrusted by Tojo's circle for his blunt tongue and his ties to a rival faction. When the Great Pacific War began, they gave him his mission, perhaps half hoping the jungles of Malaya would simply swallow him. Instead, they handed him the stage for the greatest triumph of his life. In December 1941, as Japanese bombs rained down on Pearl Harbor, Yamashita launched his invasion of British Malaya. His prize lay 600 miles to the south, the greatest symbol of British power in all of Asia, the island fortress of Singapore. To the British, Singapore was far more than a naval base. It was the very proof that the sun would never set on their empire. Its fall was simply unthinkable. Singapore was supposed to be impregnable. The British called it the Gibraltar of the East. Its huge guns pointed out to sea, ready to shatter any fleet that dared approach. Yamashita didn't come by sea. He came through the jungle, from behind, from the one direction no one believed an army could pass. Everyone had assumed the dense Malayan jungle was simply impassable to a modern force. Yamashita proved them wrong in the most humiliating way possible. He put his infantry on bicycles, thousands of them, pedaling down jungle tracks and plantation roads, moving faster than the British could retreat. When the tires wore through, his men rode on the bare metal rims, and the clatter of steel on the roads sounded. To the terrified defenders, like tanks, time after time, the British tried to make a stand. Time after time, the Japanese slipped around their flanks and forced them back. At a river called the Slim, his tanks smashed clean through the British line in a single night, taking thousands of prisoners and throwing the whole defense into chaos. At sea, the disaster was just as total. Britain had sent 2 mighty warships to defend Malaya, the battleship Prince of Wales and the battlecruiser Repulse. Within days, Japanese aircraft found them at sea and sent them both to the bottom. In a single afternoon, British naval power in the region simply ceased to exist. Singapore was now cut off, and Yamashita was coming. By now, the sheer speed of his advance had broken something in the defenders' minds. Rumor raced ahead of his columns that the Japanese were unstoppable, that they were everywhere at once, and a fear took hold that no fortress wall could keep out. The tiger was winning the battle inside his enemies' heads long before he reached the gates. In just 70 days, he had driven the entire length of the Malay Peninsula, 600 miles of enemy ground. It stands as one of the fastest campaigns of conquest in modern history. One position after another, the British were outfought and outrun. Yamashita never gave them a single moment to catch their breath or dig in. He understood, deep in his bones, that speed itself was a weapon that a smaller force moving fast could shatter a larger one standing still. Then, at last, he stood at the water's edge, staring across the strait at the fortress itself. Here, Yamashita faced a problem the legend often leaves out. He was running out of everything. His men were exhausted, his supply line stretched to the snapping point, his artillery down to its final shells. He was also badly, dangerously outnumbered. Behind Singapore's defenses waited a British and Commonwealth army of around 85,000 men. Yamashita had barely 30,000. He was outnumbered by nearly 3 to 1, the exact reverse of how a siege is supposed to work. By every rule of war, he was the one who should have been in trouble. So he did the only thing left to him. He bluffed. He masked his weakness, shifting troops by night to look like a far larger force than he had. He hurled a thunderous bombardment across the strait, hiding just how few shells he had left. The moment his troops set foot on the island, he demanded the British surrender at once, before they could discover how weak he truly was. The two commanders met in a bombed-out car factory. Across the table sat the British general, Arthur Percival, pale, shaken, his hands trembling. Yamashita slammed his fist on the table and demanded a single answer: yes or no. It was pure theater and pure nerve. Had Percival called the bluff and fought on, it might have been Yamashita who was destroyed. But the British general was broken. His water supply was cut, his city was burning, and behind him huddled 1 million terrified civilians. Percival said yes. On the 15th of February, 1942, around 80,000 British Empire soldiers laid down their arms. It was the largest surrender in all of British military history. Winston Churchill called it the worst disaster his nation had ever suffered in war. For the 80,000 men who surrendered that day, the nightmare had only just begun. They vanished into Japanese prison camps for 3.5 years. Many were shipped off as slave labor worked, starved, and beaten as they built railways through the jungle, where they died by the thousands. The fall of Singapore did more than break an army. It shattered the myth of European invincibility in Asia forever. Yamashita had won it all on a bluff, as he confessed long afterward. His whole attack had been a bluff that worked. Consider what that means. The greatest British defeat of the war was won by an army that was itself nearly finished. It was not steel, and it was not numbers that took Singapore. It was one man's nerve and one enemy's despair overnight. He became a legend, the Tiger of Malaya. In Japan, his face filled the newspapers, and the conquest of Singapore was celebrated as the triumph of the age. He had handed his nation its most complete victory of the entire war. By every rule of ambition, it should have earned him the highest commands in the empire. Instead, his triumph had made him a marked man, and that legend very nearly destroyed him. Because back in Tokyo, one man watched Yamashita's triumph with envy, not pride. His old rival, Hideki Tojo, was now the most powerful man in Japan, both war minister and prime minister. Tojo had no desire for a war hero who might one day outshine him. So at the very summit of his fame, Yamashita was quietly pushed aside, not to a greater command, but to a lonely post in Manchuria, thousands of miles from the real war. The most gifted battlefield commander Japan possessed was placed on a shelf and left there for more than 2 years. As the tide of the Pacific turned slowly against Japan, the Tiger sat idle. He drilled troops who would never see the battles that mattered. From the sidelines, he watched Japan lose Guadalcanal, lose the Solomons, lose the skies over the ocean. The one commander who might have changed the course of it all was kept far from the fighting by the pettiness of a jealous rival. It was a staggering waste, and it would help doom everything still to come. One thing, though, It's worth making very clear, Yamashita was no gentle hero. In the shadow of his great victory, a far darker chapter had unfolded. Under his overall command, Japanese forces carried out a systematic massacre of Chinese civilians across Singapore. Thousands were dragged from their homes and killed. The true toll is disputed, but it ran well into the tens of thousands. It was a war crime for which Yamashita would never stand trial. Hold on to that fact. It will matter terribly at the very end of this story. For now, the Tiger of Malaya remained caged in Manchuria, all but forgotten, half a world away. His fate was already being shaped by another man entirely, an American general, nursing the wounds of the worst defeat of his life and swearing before the entire world that he would return. Douglas MacArthur was, in almost every way imaginable, Yamashita's opposite. Where Yamashita was a country doctor's son, MacArthur was born into American military royalty. His father, Arthur MacArthur, had won the Medal of Honor as a teenager in the Civil War and later governed the Philippines as its military ruler. Douglas grew up on rugged frontier army posts, where, as he liked to say, he learned to ride and shoot before he could read or write. He claimed his very first memory was the sound of an army bugle. From the start, greatness wasn't merely hoped for in him, it was demanded, and he delivered. He entered West Point and graduated first in his class, one of the finest academic records the Academy had ever recorded. In the First World War, he led men over the top in France with a reckless, theatrical courage. He refused to wear a gas mask or carry a weapon, striding through the shell fire with a riding crop and a scarf. He came home the single most decorated American soldier of the entire war. But Douglas MacArthur grasped something that set him apart from nearly every other general of his time. He understood the power of image. Early on, he'd served as the Army's very first press officer, and he never once forgot the lesson. A great deed was only half the battle. The other half was making certain the world knew about it. One officer who served under him put it bluntly: MacArthur could never see a sun in the sky, so long as he himself was the sun. He was brilliant, brave, fine, and utterly certain of his own destiny. In 1941, that destiny carried him to the Philippines and straight into catastrophe. When Japan struck Pearl Harbor, MacArthur was the American commander in the Philippines. He had tens of thousands of American and Filipino troops and hours of warning that the Japanese were on their way. Yet on that very first day, his entire air force was caught on the ground and destroyed. Rows of American planes, lined up neatly on their airfields, were smashed into burning wreckage before they could even fight. It was a catastrophe, and historians argue to this day over how a warned commander let it happen. With the skies lost, the Japanese poured ashore, and MacArthur's army was driven back onto a jungle peninsula called Bataan. He declared the capital, Manila, an open city spared, he said, from destruction, and pulled his army back for a last stand. Remember that decision. 3 years later, on that very same ground, another general would make the same one and be hanged for what followed. There, his men began to starve. They ran short of food, of medicine, of ammunition. They ate their own horses. They called themselves the Battling Bastards of Bataan. And where was their commander? MacArthur spent almost the entire siege inside the fortified tunnels of Corregidor, a rock island just off the coast. Across all those desperate weeks, he visited the front lines on Bataan exactly once. His bitter, starving troops gave him a nickname that would trail him for the rest of his life. They called him Dugout Doug. Then, as the end drew near, President Roosevelt ordered MacArthur to escape, to slip away, and carry on the war from Australia. On a black night in March 1942, he boarded a small torpedo boat with his wife and young son and slipped away through Japanese patrolled waters. He left his army behind. When he reached safety, he spoke 3 words that would become among the most famous of the war: "I shall return." Washington asked him to soften it to, "We shall return to make the promise about the nation, not the man." He refused. It would be about him. The men he left behind would pay a horrifying price for that lost campaign. A month later, Bataan surrendered, the largest surrender in American military history. Some 76,000 American and Filipino prisoners were forced to march 60 miles through blistering tropical heat with almost no food or water. Those who stumbled or fell behind were beaten, bayoneted, or shot by the side of the road. Thousands died on that march. It became infamous as the Bataan Death March. It remains one of the darkest atrocities of the entire Pacific War. Here, the myth-making machine did something remarkable for losing the Philippines. Douglas MacArthur was awarded his nation's highest decoration, the Medal of Honor. It was, in part, a deliberate act of propaganda meant to keep a hero's shine on a humiliating defeat. The award even made Douglas and his father the first father and son ever to both receive the medal. The general who had fled a lost battlefield now wore the very same medal as the men who died holding it. Now, to be fair to MacArthur, what came next revealed a genuinely gifted commander. Marooned in Australia, he was handed the vast, brutal Southwest Pacific, thousands of miles of jungle, mountain, and open ocean. There, over 2 long years, he fought one of the most economical campaigns of the entire war. The Japanese had turned islands like Rabaul into gigantic fortresses, bristling with troops, aircraft, and guns. The obvious move was to storm them head-on, one bloody island at a time. MacArthur refused. Instead, he leapfrogged. He simply went around the strongest Japanese positions, landed his men on weakly held beaches, and cut the great fortresses off from their supply lines, bypassed and starving. Tens of thousands of Japanese troops were left to wither on the vine, useless, without a single shot being fired at them. He hopped 1,500 miles up the coast of New Guinea this way, spending the lives of his men with a caution that surprised his own staff, while other Allied commanders bled out thousands of men storming islands like Tarawa and Iwo Jima head-on. MacArthur's losses were a fraction of theirs. By any honest measure, it was a masterclass in modern warfare. The man was no fraud. When he was handed the right tools, he could truly fight. But here is the distinction that decides everything. His brilliant campaign was carried, every single mile of it, by that same overwhelming machine, the endless ships, planes, and supplies that Japan could no longer hope to match. Give a commander like Yamashita those same tools, and who can say what he might have done? MacArthur had them. Yamashita never would. So how did a man who began the war in such humiliation end it as America's towering hero? This is the very heart of the whole story. Skill alone did not do it. Plenty of able generals fought and won, and history has forgotten their names. MacArthur became immortal on the shoulders of 2 forces far greater than any single commander. The first was the machine. While Japan's industry strained and cracked, America's factories had roared to life on a scale the world had never witnessed. An ocean of ships, planes, tanks, and guns, more war material than every other nation on Earth combined. No general on the Japanese side, however gifted, could hold back that tide. Not Yamashita, not anyone alive. And the second force was the myth. MacArthur was a master at building his own legend, perhaps the greatest the American Army has ever produced. When he finally returned to the Philippines in October 1944, he made absolutely certain the world was watching. But his return did not come cheaply, and it did not come from him alone. To put a single man back on Philippine soil, the United States Navy fought the largest naval battle in the history of the world. Off the coast of Leyte, hundreds of warships clashed across hundreds of miles of open sea. The last great fleet of the Japanese Empire steamed out to smash the landings and was itself smashed. Japanese battleships and carriers went to the bottom by the dozen, dragging the Empire's final hopes down with them. It was the machine, unleashed upon the sea, clearing a path to a single beach. And onto that beach, the machine had won for him. MacArthur made his entrance. He waded ashore through the surf at Leyte, jaw set, eyes blazing, and the cameras caught it perfectly. The photograph became one of the most iconic images of the entire war. Here's a detail the legend quietly leaves out. That first famous wade ashore wasn't staged at all. His landing craft simply couldn't reach the beach, and the scowl on his face was pure fury at being made to get his feet wet. But MacArthur was far too shrewd to waste a gift like that. At his next landing, he deliberately ordered his boat to swing away from a perfectly dry pier so that he could wade ashore all over again. For the cameras, he knew exactly what he was doing. Then he stood on that beach, spoke into a radio microphone, and declared, "People of the Philippines, I have returned, not we. I. His press machine flooded the world with communiques, and they had a way of placing a single name at the center of every victory, his own. He even refused to call his landing D-Day, insisting on his own name for it. So his moment could never be confused with the beaches of Normandy. Walking the captured shore, he came upon the bodies of Japanese soldiers and nudged one with his boot, naming their unit. They did the dirty work on Bataan, he said. He had not only come back, he had come back for them. He strolled through sniper fire as though it simply could not touch him. And perhaps, by then, he half believed it. Every step was a performance, and every performance became history. The machine won the war. The myth decided who would be remembered for it, and the Tiger of Malaya. Through all of this, what had become of him? As Japan's empire crumbled, the very government that had exiled him finally, desperately, called him back. In October 1944, they handed Yamashita command of the defense of the Philippines. By then, it was a hopeless assignment. He arrived to find a shattered supply system, collapsing morale, and scattered troops he barely controlled. His best divisions had been bled white on other islands before he even arrived. The Navy and the Army each answered to their own masters and often ignored him entirely. He was a master swordsman, handed a broken blade, and told to win. Yamashita took command just 11 days before MacArthur's invasion came crashing ashore. Yamashita was far too good a soldier not to see the truth. The Philippines could not be held. So he made a cold, professional decision. He would not throw his army away defending the capital, Manila, in a hopeless house to house bloodbath. Instead, he ordered his forces to abandon the city and pull back into the mountains of the north, to tie the Americans down in a long, grinding campaign. He ordered Manila to be evacuated, and that order was disobeyed. Around 20,000 Japanese naval troops, under a separate commander, a naval officer named Iwabuchi, flatly refused to leave. Iwabuchi had lost his battleship earlier in the war and survived a deep disgrace in the eyes of his own warrior code. Now he chose to make Manila his final, bloody stand in direct defiance of Yamashita's explicit orders. What followed was one of the most horrific atrocities of the entire war. As American troops fought their way into the city, Iwabuchi's men turned their rage on the civilians trapped inside it. In churches, hospitals, schools, and family homes, they murdered, raped, and mutilated on a monstrous scale. By the time it ended, more than 100,000 Filipino civilians were dead. Manila, once called the Pearl of the Orient, was ground into rubble, the second most devastated Allied capital of the war. After Warsaw, the one man who had ordered the city spared, Yamashita, was far away in the mountain, powerless to stop it. In those mountains, the old tiger showed his claws one final time. With a starving, broken army, he tied down a vastly larger American force for months on end. Refusing to break, he would hold out in those hills, waging his hopeless, delaying war until the very day Japan surrendered. Still unbeaten in the field, he was fighting on when the word finally reached him that Japan itself had laid down its arms. Only then did the Tiger of Malaya walk down out of the mountains and give himself up. Gaunt and worn, he surrendered with the stiff dignity of a professional soldier who had done his duty to the very last. He had lost, but he had never once faced Douglas MacArthur across a battlefield. Their duel was still to come, and it would be fought not with armies, but with lawyers. So, who was the better general? Let's weigh them the way history has, to one measure at a time. Begin with pure battlefield command, the raw art of maneuvering an army and beating the enemy right in front of you. Here, the honest answer is an uncomfortable one for the legend. Yamashita's conquest of Malaya and Singapore was a masterpiece, a smaller, weaker force annihilating a larger one through speed, nerve, and sheer deception. MacArthur's early war, by brutal contrast, was a chain of disasters, a wrecked air force, a starving army, and a controversial escape. On the narrow question of generalship in the field, Yamashita holds the stronger claim. But wars are not won by battlefield brilliance alone. They are won by supply, by industry, by the sheer weight of what a nation can build and ship and feed to its armies. Here, it was never a contest. MacArthur commanded the resources of the most powerful industrial nation on Earth. Yamashita commanded the scraps of a collapsing empire, starved of fuel, of ships, of men. On the war of production, MacArthur wins, but so would almost anyone standing where he stood. Then there is the strangest measure of all, the one the movies never mention: the war for memory, and at that. Douglas MacArthur may have been the finest general of the century. He turned a humiliating defeat into a heroic legend, and a soaked walk through the surf into an immortal image. Yamashita won the battles. MacArthur won the story, and that is the uncomfortable heart of it. Their contest was never truly decided by which man was the better soldier. It was decided by the machine. And the myth, let's be clear about the two men themselves. Neither was a saint, neither was a simple villain. Both were brilliant, both were deeply flawed, and both, in their way, had blood on their hands. But step back from the two generals for a moment, and remember who actually paid for all of it. Remember the men of Bataan, abandoned on their peninsula, marched to their deaths in the tropical heat, while their commander became a hero overseas. Remember the 100,000 civilians of Manila, men, women, and children slaughtered in a battle that one general never wanted, and the other never saw. That is the true arithmetic of this war. Not the medal, not the photographs, the dead. Two nations would raise monuments to their generals. Far fewer would remember the clerk, the nurse, the child of Manila, whose only crime was to be caught between two armies. In the end, they are who this story is truly about. It was in the shadow of those 100,000 Manila dead that the final duel between MacArthur and Yamashita was fought at last. Just weeks after Japan's surrender, Yamashita was placed on trial for war crimes. The court that would decide his fate was an American military commission, and it had been appointed by Douglas MacArthur. 5 American generals sat in judgment. Not one of them was a lawyer. Not one had ever commanded troops in combat. The charge laid against Yamashita was something new in the history of war. He was not accused of ordering the atrocities in Manila. He was not even accused of knowing that they had happened. He was accused of failing to control the troops who committed them. It made no difference that those troops were naval forces, under an entirely different commander. It made no difference that they had openly defied his direct order to leave the city. It made no difference that his communications had collapsed, or that he was miles away in the mountains. As the overall commander, the prosecution argued it was simply his duty to know, and his failure to stop the horror made him guilty of it. The trial lasted a little over a month. On the 7th of December, 1945, 4 years to the day after Pearl Harbor, Yamashita was found guilty and sentenced to hang. His own American defense lawyers were appalled. One of them, an Army lawyer named Frank Reel, would spend much of his life afterward arguing that his client had been railroaded to the gallows. The prosecution could not point to a single order Yamashita had given to harm a civilian. They could not prove he had even known what Iwabuchi's men were doing, cut off as he was in the mountains. Their entire case rested on one sweeping idea that a commander answers for everything his troops do, whether he knows of it or not. They believed he was being punished not for what he had done, but for what his men had done, and underneath it all, for being the enemy who had humbled the West at Singapore. They carried the case all the way to the Supreme Court of the United States, and the highest court in America upheld the sentence, but not without a bitter fight. 2 of the justices dissented in fury. Justice Frank Murphy warned that the court had taken a man's life using a standard that could one day be turned against any commander, in any war, on any side. The proceedings, he wrote, reeked less of justice than of the raw desire to make a defeated enemy pay. They condemned the trial as a betrayal of everything American justice was supposed to stand for, an exercise in vengeance, dressed up as law, but the ruling held. And the man with the final say over Yamashita's life was the very same man he had never beaten in battle, Douglas MacArthur. MacArthur confirmed the death sentence. Now, before we cast Yamashita as a pure and simple victim, one hard truth has to be faced. He was not an innocent man. Back in Singapore, under his own command, thousands of Chinese civilians had been massacred, a crime he was never once charged with. If any court on earth had the right to hang Tomoyuki Yamashita, it was arguably for that. So the question that hangs over his gallows is not a simple one. Was he guilty? Yes, but perhaps of the wrong crime. Was his trial justice? Or was it the victor writing history with a rope? Historians and legal scholars have argued over it ever since. Because that trial did something that outlived both men. It established a principle now known as command responsibility. The idea that a commander can be held accountable for the crimes of his troops. It became a cornerstone of international law, cited at Nuremberg and in war crimes trials to this very day. Generals and dictators have been called to account by it ever since. A single dispute hanging in the Philippines had quietly reshaped the laws of war. A doctrine that has since shielded countless innocents was born from a trial that many believe condemned an innocent man. Which brings us back to a wooden staircase in the Philippines. On a February morning in 1946, 13 steps, a heavy-set man climbing them slowly toward a rope. The Tiger of Malaya, the man who had seized Singapore and humbled an empire, met his end not on a battlefield, but on a scaffold. By the order of a rival he had never once defeated. And Douglas MacArthur, for 5 years, he governed a defeated Japan with the power of a shogun, rebuilding a shattered nation in America's image. He would command in one more war, in Korea, and be fired by a president for his defiance. When he finally died, he was mourned as one of the immortal soldiers of the Republic. The conqueror was remembered as a criminal. The man who lost the Philippines was remembered as its savior. That is what the machine and the myth can do. So we're left with you. And a question history has never truly settled. Who was the better general, the Tiger who won impossible victories, or the American who mastered the machine and the legend? And when Yamashita climbed those 13 steps, was that justice for 100,000 dead? Or was it simply the winner's revenge? Two brilliant soldiers on opposite sides of the same war. One died a legend. The other died at the end of a rope. And the difference between them may have had far less to do with who was right than with who won. The battlefield never gave us a clean answer. Perhaps only you can. Tell me what you think in the comments. I'll be reading every single one.
Thanks for staying until the end. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more. Your support is incredibly valuable to us and helps this channel grow.